Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Ji Ha-ham. The top diplomats of South Korea and China had a meeting this week and discussed a wide range of bilateral and regional issues. While South Korea has reiterated its position on the U.S. anti-missile defense system THAAD, China demanded South Korea to maintain the three no's policy. Meanwhile, the Russian ambassador to Pyongyang said that North Korea could send workers to Donbass to help rebuild the region. Today, we'll discuss these and more.
한국政府正式对外作出三不一线的政策宣示.
국익과 원칙에 따라 화의 부동의 정신으로 중국과의 협력을 모색해 나갈 것입니다.
In the studio with me is William Brown, professor at the University of Maryland. Professor Brown spent 4 decades in the U.S. government, including the CIA and the Commerce Department, focusing on the North Korean and Chinese economies. Scott Snyder is also with me today. Mr. Snyder is Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the show. Good to have you both today.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's fine to be here. Yeah.
In the ministerial meeting between South Korea and China, THAAD was one of the topics that the two sides exchanged their different views. China's foreign ministry said that Seoul had committed to a policy of three no's, but South Korea insisted that the three no's were never a promise. Professor Brown, the US and South Korea argue that THAAD is purely defensive measure to ensure security of South Korea. But how come China obsesses so much over this?
Yeah, you know, I follow China quite a lot, and over time, this is one of the most peculiar episodes from China, why they take it out so much on THAAD. So I try to understand it, and usually doing that, I try to put myself in Beijing's shoes a little bit. Why would they be so worried about THAAD, which is clearly an anti-missile system, a defensive system? I'm thinking, though, if you're in China, especially in Beijing, and you look out over the Pacific, for a long time, they've thought the US and other countries are trying to surround them. And if you're looking out over the Pacific from Beijing, the first thing you see is Korea as an obstacle. And then you see anti-missile defense, Korea. The other thing is, if you look at what's going on in Taiwan, their modernization, China's modernization, is heavily dependent on missiles. They're shooting missiles, very modern ones, everywhere. That's basically their defense. So, and their anti-missile defense is not near as advanced, I don't think, as their actual missiles. So, maybe those two things come together, and you know, they really react negatively about missile defense, something they don't have much of in Korea, right across the Yellow Sea. But it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And certainly for South Korea, missile defense is imperative. Why not? So they're asking something, Beijing is asking for something that they're not going to get. And why they push something they're not going to get, you know, it's a mystery, it really is.
Mr. Snyder, can we say it is reasonable for a country to demand another nation something like three no's? Some criticize that it is disrespectful to a sovereign nation.
Well, I think that question really lies with the question of what does China see as a security threat. And just to elaborate on what Bill said, China has a geostrategic objective of trying to make sure that the U.S.-South Korea alliance in its application is only limited to North Korea and does not have a regional application. And so I think that that is the reason why they're objecting to that. But I also believe that it's very clear that the South Korean government, the Defense Department Ministry, and the South Korean media have thoroughly rejected the Chinese effort out of hand to apply the three no's to the Korean Peninsula. And even the State Department spokesperson made a statement on this. And so that effort, I think, has been rejected in its current form. But I do think that the Chinese security concerns that underlie this remain and will be a subject of dialogue.
China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi said both sides should remain independent and free from external obstacles and influences. The minister later said that China has presented the so-called 5-point commitment to South Korea. Professor, what do you think of this 5-point commitment?
Well, you know, it's, I hate to use the word pablum, so I think it's some kind of mumbo-jumbo coming out of Beijing, to tell you the truth. I don't read much into it. I'm not really that focused on those kind of really propagandist kind of talk. They always like to have numbers, 3 no's, 4, whatever, 6 parties. They like to have now 5 whatevers. I would call them the 5 whatevers. Chinese kind of like that term. So let's just call them the 5 whatevers.
Yes. Mr. Snyder, some point out that China's demand was aimed at the U.S.-ROK relations. How should South Korea react?
Well, I think that what really happens is the Chinese government makes these aspirational statements that they want to have applied to the particular relationship. And in the case of the 5 commitments, there are a number of commitments that China is putting forward for South Korea to make that directly conflict with imperatives of the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And so it's pretty clear that in those cases, China is trying to use these commitments in order to undermine or weaken the alliance. And I think the most notable dimensions of those commitments that are intended to do that are, one, an expression that the China-South Korea relationship should be conducted on a quote-unquote independent basis. 2, the idea that openness is necessary as related to supply chain issues. And so those are the 2, I think, most significant areas where the commitments actually are a direct challenge to the direction of the U.S.-South Korea security alliance.
The South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol's decision to skip a meeting with U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi caused a controversy in South Korea last week. Meanwhile, South Korea has decided to attend a preliminary meeting of the Chip 4, a U.S.-led semiconductor alliance. But South Korean news media reported that the South Korean officials expressed their wishes not to irritate China over this meeting. Professor Brown, the Yoon government, during the election campaign, hinted at a tough stance on China, but now many doubt their willingness. Why is this?
Well, Korea is in a tough place. It's always been a tough place. It's neighbor to China. It's a very good friend of America. But you got to think it's going to be a neighbor of China for the next 1,000 years. So it has to work, both America and China, all the time. President Yoon won the election, basically, of siding on the U.S. side. And of course, Washington is very appreciative of that. And I think mostly he's doing that. He's being pretty tough on China. But there's a limit. And he was barely elected. It was a very close election. He has to worry about his own economy. South Korean economy is not in great shape. Neither is China's, neither is ours. So economic issues rise to the fore when you're having trouble. And I think, he has to make careful decisions on how to deal with Beijing.
Okay. But still, if we compare this with Japan, Japan is taking a different path, it seems like.
In a way, it is. Japan, of course, has a lot of other troubles with the Abe assassination, and its economy is in difficult too. But Japan is a few hundred miles further away than Korea is from China. It makes a big difference. Japan really does not face a military threat the way Korea does. Korea, we can't forget, we can never forget, Korea has a huge military challenge from North Korea. And we all need Chinese support in that really important issue with North Korea.
Mr. Snyder, South Korea seems to be cautious about doing anything that would offend China. But wouldn't this harm ultimately the alliance between the US and South Korea?
Well, it could if indeed that is what is happening. But I think that what we are really seeing is overall, with the exception being the Pelosi visit, is South Korean alignment with the United States on many issues. And so in that context, I think that this issue of the Pelosi non-meeting is going to end up just being a blip on the radar screen. I mean, Yoon has already met with Senator Markey just this week. And so I think that the issue of Pelosi, not meeting Pelosi is already fading from people's focus. I'm not saying that it wasn't a mistake, but I just think that the impact of that mistake is going to be relatively minor.
You know, I do think over the long term, I've been a little bit sad the way South Korea has treated Taiwan from 20, 30 years ago. Taiwan is a good supporter, democracy, capitalist trade. South Korea trades enormously with Taiwan. And it's kind of given Taiwan the cold shoulder, not more than kind of. So I think there's maybe some opportunity here for Korea to reach out to Taiwan in a better way.
Not only the United States, but South Korea seems to have expectations for China on the North Korean issue. Foreign Minister Park Jin asked his counterpart to persuade North Korea to return to the negotiating table. Mr. Snyder, can China persuade North Korea?
No, I don't think that China is going to be able to persuade North Korea, and I think that that's the reason why the Biden administration appears to have shifted its strategy as it anticipates the possibility of another North Korean nuclear test. And here, the really significant thing is that North Korea may have assumptions about how the Biden administration will handle a test. Mainly the assumption that we'll go back to the usual playbook and the response will be business as usual. But the State Department spokesperson this week mentioned very clearly the possibility of military type responses of various sorts to a possible North Korean nuclear test, and that is not in the usual playbook. So I think that the North Koreans need to re-examine their assumptions.
Professor Brown, even though Mr. Snyder said China cannot or will not do much on North Korea, but let's say China is willing to persuade North Korea, what would be your advice to Chinese officials?
For the Chinese officials, I would, if I were the Chinese, and even myself, I would be saying to Pyongyang, look in your own best interest, not in our Beijing interest, not in Washington. Look at your own interest. Your own interests are in getting your economy back in shape. You're in a lot of trouble. We can help you. The world is ready to help you. Beijing, China is ready to help. There's no need for you to exacerbate world tensions even more with some kind of nuclear test. So just don't do it. If you do it, we'll have to revisit sanctions. We'll have to look at a lot of different issues. So let's just not go that way. And the interesting thing to me is we've been talking about a nuclear test for 6 months now. It hasn't happened. It hasn't happened in 5 years. So I'm thinking that China is playing that game. The trade issue, there's very little trade going on between China and North Korea. That's a phenomenal difference from several years ago.
Meanwhile, the Russian ambassador to North Korea said that North Korea could send workers to Donbass to help rebuild the region. But A State Department spokesperson told VOA that DPRK workers dispatched overseas, including Russian-controlled areas of Ukraine, would be in clear violation of United Nations Security Council resolutions. Professor Brown, how realistic is this?
I think not too realistic. I mean, North Korean workers are in Russia today, a lot of them, and in China. That part of the resolution, the sanctions, was delayed for a couple of years. It's never really, it's a very confusing one, to tell you the truth. And even arguably, I didn't like it, to tell you the truth, because I like the idea of North Korean workers leaving North Korea for China or Russia. Of course, not to Ukraine. That's a whole nother matter. And you wonder what would happen if they get harmed, if they get killed. It would be just a tremendous tragedy for North Korea for that to happen. So I'm thinking it's probably not going to happen. Donbass can probably fix itself. It is kind of curious, though, because you remember after the Korean War, huge numbers of East Germans, especially Russians and Eastern Soviet citizens, came in and rebuilt North Korea. Hamhung City is rebuilt by Germans, basically. So it would be kind of a tit for tat, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Mr. Snyder, what's your thought on this? Is this one way Russia press the United States?
Yeah, I actually have a different view from Bill on this. I think that it is plausible that North Korea could send workers to the Donbass, primarily because Russia has a pressing political need. North Korea will be willing to meet that need if they're paid enough. And Russia is not enforcing the UN sanctions resolutions anyway and has actually been lobbying to have them reduced. And so I don't think that there is anything that is blocking the possibility of some kind of deal between North Korea and Russia where North Korean workers could go to the Donbass. The only thing I would say is that it would be telling if a North Korean worker would be willing to take that risk of going to the Donbass to do work rather than staying in their own country.
And earlier there was talk about North Korean troops going to fight in Ukraine. Remember last week they were talking about that. That would be a far more serious issue for North Korea to do that. Now they're not talking about that so much, they're talking about workers. It's much, in a sense you could have a small number of workers may already be there, who knows, that wouldn't be such a lightning rod as actually North Korean troops going to fight. That would be extraordinary change in the dimension for North Korea.
Even though we see China, Russia, and North Korea's efforts to strengthen their relations, the North Korean economy is still not in a good shape. The trade between North Korea and the other two remain extremely low. Professor Brown, VOA recently found out that North Korea's accumulated trade deficit with China exceeded 10 billion over the past decades. You've probably been asked this question in quite a long time, but how much longer North Korea can maintain its economy like this?
I think that really another way to ask the question is how long will North Korean people tolerate this incredibly inefficient economy? North Korea has a lot of resources. It's one thing we don't quite understand or recognize. They have tremendous capital resources, human capital. Everybody can read and write. That's a huge advantage. They have a lot of minerals and metals. They're in a wonderful location between rich Japan, rich South Korea, booming China. And they're a perfect location for incredibly rapid development. They've not taken advantage of that. And I would say their productivity in the use of capital, in the use of labor, is probably about the lowest in the whole world. They're very poor for one reason. They're not productive. Why are they not productive? They're not productive not because they don't work hard, they work very hard. Their system doesn't allow them to create the productivity that the rest of the world has. They get some though. So like with modern technology, they have modern phones, modern cell phones, modern smartphones. They have internal internet. All these kind of things they've added to the world productivity enormously. But in Korea gets that technology, but their system just can't take good advantage of it. So my question is really, how long can North Korean people, including the elites, including even the regime, tolerate this incredibly poorly productive system?
So, the missing element from the official trade figure balance sheet is North Korean earnings from cyber theft and from cryptocurrencies. And we know from recent reports that remains a substantial input to the North Korean economy. And so when we're asking why hasn't the North Korean economy already failed, we have to go to this question of the missing part of the balance sheet that we don't see.
Professor Brown, just like the nuclear issue, as you mentioned, the North Korea's economy is one area we don't see much progress. As an economist, what would be your recommendation to Kim Jong-un then?
If I were him right now, key thing is finance for him. He's done a pretty good job of keeping the won stable, something his father and grandfather did not do. The won was pretty stable at about 8,000 won for several years after he came. A very good stability because that allowed markets to develop. Now, in the last 2 years, though, this is coming unraveled. Even now, we see the won. So the won strengthened for a long time as they were not importing anything. They weren't spending money, so they were protecting the won. They protected the won by not creating won, by being very careful in printing money. The opposite of what we're doing, right? The opposite of the rest of the world is printing money. They have not been printing money, and that supported the won's value. The problem for them now, though, is I think the trade is about to open with China. Dollars are flowing out again. The won is starting to crumble. They need to reinvigorate their own balance sheet, their own finance, the government's balance. I would just, a simple solution for that, not simple, but what a needed solution would be for him to start selling state assets to the private sector in North Korea. That might sound anti-socialist, but they own the basic country. They own the country basically. There's plenty of room for them to sell property, sell assets, sell coal mines, and recoup government finance that way. That's my specific short-term solution. Long-term, of course, they need to make an agreement with the U.S. on nuclearization. They need to get property rights in order. They need to allow farmers to own their land, like Kim Il-sung said. People should own their land. He should go back to that kind of formulation.
Mr. Snyder, anything to add?
Yeah, just stepping back broadly speaking, when Kim Jong-un came to power, he talked about Byungjin, the simultaneous pursuit of military and economic development. We've seen the failure of the economic policy, and he's really only standing on the military development part, and he's making the wrong choice. And so in order for North Korea to actually survive economically, he's going to have to make an adjustment and figure out how to deal with the economic aspect of his agenda.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un declared victory in the battle against the coronavirus and ordered his country to lift the maximum anti-epidemic measures. Even though the country claims that it is free from the coronavirus, Kim Jong-un's sister Kim Yo-jong blamed leaflets flown across the border from South Korea for causing the outbreak. How the new situation will affect North Korea's external policy and its attitude toward the United States and South Korea will be something to watch. Professor Brown, Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Yeah.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.